Imagine a restaurant with one unusual rule. Everyone at the table can order whatever they want. There is no limit on ordering. The limit comes later when the bill arrives. Then, and only then, the table votes on whether to pay. And here is the strange part. Refusing to pay would not undo the dinner. The food is already eaten. The only thing a no vote can do is leave the bill unpaid and ruin this table's good name. This is not a story about careless people. It is, almost word for word, the written budget procedure of the United States government. And this week, the bill crossed $40 trillion. On August 19th, 2026, the national debt of the United States passed $40 trillion for the first time, months earlier than forecasters expected, partly because the Supreme Court struck down a set of tariffs and the revenue vanished. The pace is easier to feel than the total. The government now borrows about $6 billion every day. More than half of that new borrowing goes to a single line item: interest on the money it already borrowed. Interest costs are running near $1.2 trillion a year. That is more than the entire defense budget, more than every soldier, ship, and aircraft combined. The first trillion took the country almost 200 years to accumulate. The most recent trillion took less than 5 months. Divided among every American, the debt comes to about $116,000 per person. And here is the detail most headlines skip. All of this happened under a legal debt limit. It is written in statute. Right now, it stands at $41.1 trillion after Congress raised it by $5 trillion in July of 2025. At the current pace, the government hits the ceiling again sometime in 2027. So the obvious debate begins. Who spent all this money? One side points at tax cuts, the other at spending programs, and both are describing real things. But zoom out and a stranger fact appears. Since 1960, Congress has raised, extended, or revised that debt limit 78 times, 49 times under Republican presidents, 29 under Democrats. It has never once held a speed limit that every driver breaks might be a driver problem. A speed limit that the traffic authority itself raises 78 times is something else. The question is not who is speeding. The question is what this limit actually limits. To see the answer, follow the money through the pipe, because the American budget really is a pipe with 3 stations. Station 1, spending. Congress orders things in appropriations bills and in permanent programs like Social Security and Medicare. Nothing at this station mentions any limit. Station 2, taxes. Congress decides in entirely separate laws how much money comes in. Nothing here mentions a limit either. The gap between the two is the deficit, and borrowing simply follows as arithmetic. Once the orders are placed and the taxes are set, the debt is already determined. Nobody votes on it. It is just subtraction. The debt limit sits at Station 3, the checkout. It does not cap what Congress may order. It caps whether the Treasury may pay for what Congress already ordered. That placement was an accident of history. Until 1917, Congress approved every single loan individually. Then came the First World War, and Congress gave the Treasury a general permission to borrow under one total cap, so the permission would not be unlimited. The ceiling was born as a longer leash, not as a break. And a limit at the checkout has exactly one way to say no. Refusing to pay bills the country has already run up, a default, which means the rule's only weapon points at the country's own credit. In 2011, a standoff over the ceiling cost the United States its perfect credit rating from Standard & Poor's, the first downgrade in the country's history. Fitch followed in 2023, Moody's in 2025. All 3 named the standoffs themselves, not just the debt. So why does the rule survive? Because it is the only deadline in the entire budget system that cannot be skipped. Budget resolutions slip every year. The ceiling does not. Whoever wants leverage, either party, any year, gets one guaranteed moment when everyone must come to the table. So what would it look like to put the valve where the ordering happens? In 2001, Switzerland held a referendum on exactly that. 85% voted yes. Since 2003, the Swiss constitution caps each year's spending at roughly what the government collects, adjusted for the economic cycle. Save in good years, borrow a little in bad ones. The limit binds at the moment of ordering, not at the checkout. Swiss debt, relative to the economy, fell by nearly half. Germany wrote a similar break into its constitution in 2009, and then Germany showed everyone the price. A rule rigid enough to actually bind is rigid when you need it not to be. For years, critics blamed the break for crumbling bridges and a shrinking army. The rule cannot tell an investment from an expense. And in March 2025, facing war on the continent, Germany broke its own break open. Defense spending above 1% of economic output was exempted, and a 500 billion euro infrastructure fund was placed outside the rule entirely. That is the honest trade. A valve at the ordering end really does hold, right up until a crisis when a rule that cannot bend gets broken instead. There is a second design, and it starts with a confession. Denmark is the only other democracy with a debt ceiling written as a fixed number, a leftover from a 1993 administrative reform, not a deliberate policy. In 2010, every major Danish party together raised it once to roughly 3 times the actual debt and said the goal out loud: this number must never become a bargaining chip. Today, Danish debt sits far below the ceiling, and no one has ever heard of a Danish debt crisis. Australia went further. It introduced an American-style ceiling in the late 2000s, got its own standoff within 4 years, and in December 2013, simply abolished the ceiling. The price is the thing you lose. Remember, the ceiling is the one deadline that cannot be skipped, the single forced moment when Congress must face the sum of its own decisions, raise it out of reach or delete it, and that moment is gone. And there is a second cost, particular to Washington: the vote itself. Voting to remove the limit reads in an attack ad as voting to remove all restraint, which is why neither party wants its fingerprints on it. The third design does not move the valve and does not remove it. It welds 2 votes into one. The House of Representatives actually ran this experiment from 1979 to 1995 under what was called the Gephardt rule. Passing the annual budget automatically counted as passing the matching debt limit. One vote ordered the dinner and accepted the bill because arithmetically they were always the same decision. The price here is not economic, it is the loss of a political convenience. Under separate votes, a member of Congress can vote for a deficit budget and, months later, vote against the debt that very budget created. And both votes play well at home. Welding the votes together takes that trick away, which is exactly why the rule kept being suspended and finally died. There is a softer cousin of this idea, writing the limit as a share of the economy instead of a dollar figure. Poland carries a 60% cap in its constitution, but a ratio with no enforcement machine behind it tends to become a declaration, quietly amended when it gets close. Back at the restaurant, the argument at the table is always the same: pay the bill or refuse, and ruin the table's good name. And the bill always gets paid, 78 times in a row now. Sometime in 2027, there will be a 79th. So when that standoff fills the headlines, the interesting question is not whether they will raise the ceiling. They will. The question is why the only limit in the whole pipeline stands at the checkout, where nothing can be restrained anymore, only left unpaid, and which price you would rather pay: a break that gets broken in a crisis, a ceiling that forces nothing, or one vote that orders dinner and pays the bill in the same breath, leaving no way to vote for the meal and against the check. To allow 1,580 words, 10.5 minutes.